Their desserts. It's my pleasure to welcome Judith Johnson to this meeting. Regent Johnson comes to us first and foremost as Pamela and Paul's mom. Regent Johnson's teaching and leadership roles span 7 very diverse city and suburban school districts and extend to service in the U.S. Department of Education during the Clinton information. She was appointed to the Board of Regents for a 5-year term beginning in April 1st of 2015. Regent Johnson is known for her unrelenting commitment to public education. Whether working to transform national and educational policy to significantly improve the quality of education, leading school districts to give all children the same opportunity to succeed, or building relationships with community groups, she has built an extensive network of partners to help schools raise student achievement. On a personal note, as someone who has watched Regents meetings over the past 10 years, I see a new member of the Board of Regents who always comes well prepared with an extensive background of experience and speaks her mind in a clear and forthright way. Judith Johnson, welcome.
You'll later learn that's called performance-based assessment, figuring out how to get to the top. Thank you, Rick, for the comments, and I think what I like best about it is being Pamela and Paul's mom, because they've given up. Mom's never going to retire because the task is too large, and they know what I think and believe in. So I'd like to thank you all, first of all, for the progress and support and the voices that you offered over the last year. Now, it's too early to take a victory lap, but please take comfort in the fact that your voices were heard. So I'm going to, towards the end, give you some sense as to when that victory lap may occur. But I want to start by thanking you. So I'm going to read to you comments made by a PTA president whose name is Elise. Would Elise, by any chance, be here? She's New York State PTA president. While summer vacation for many involved with education is about downtime, relaxing, and taking it easier than during the school year, that's not my reality. At the moment, I'm staring down this year's annual appeals, fundraising initiatives, website development, grants to be funded, an annual auction, meeting planning, and working with an administration. This past year, we as PTA people helped put books in classrooms, got kids to academic, athletic, and extracurricular competitions across the country, purchased supplies for teachers, supported professional development, covered dinners for volunteers, awards for graduating seniors, instituted a teacher outreach program, updated the bylaws, and threw a teacher appreciation dinner for hundreds. And I did all of this for zero compensation. In other words, I, as a PTA person, worked for free. So would you give yourselves a round of applause, please, for the work that you did? It's for you. Thank you so much, unsung heroes. So, let me start by offering some background. All of the great social justice movements in America, from voting and civil rights, to the labor and the women's rights movements, to the fight for marriage equality, all were led by citizens fed up with an intolerable status quo. That's how societies change. Civil disobedience and you ought to be proud of this, is one of the hallmarks of our history. From the harbors in Boston in the 1700s to the luncheonette stools in Greensburg, North Carolina in the 1960s, peaceful protests bring attention to injustice. And we're going to let that ring. I'm sorry, I meant to turn that off. I'm really sorry. It follows me wherever I go. Oh, my. And I will tell you that's an East Ramapo phone call, too. I know it is. James Baldwin, in speaking to a group of college students in the 1960s, offered the following: "A country is only as strong as the people who make it up, and the country turns into what the people want it to become. Now we need to transform our state's educational system, and it will be transformed by all of us, by you and by me." America's public schools were once the vehicle that provided access to the concept of economic mobility. By the way, as I watch the polls that are beginning to come across the TV screens as the polls close, the exit polls, economic inequality and jobs turn out to be the two highest areas of concern for most Americans. I don't care what party you're a part of, that is a huge issue. Schools were once viewed as the great equalizer. The notion was that each student, regardless of birth conditions, would receive an education that led to opportunities to climb the American economic ladder of personally defined success. Today we ask, just what is the role of public education in a democratic society? The internal landscape is undergoing continuous change that requires us to engage in conversations of what it means to acquire and how we define a sound basic education. We're faced with unprecedented levels of discord and criticism about the answer to that question. What is it that students should know and be able to do as citizens and defenders of a democratic way? Content knowledge is still very necessary, but it is no longer sufficient for life. What we know is that we are citizens of a nation and of the world. And along with teaching the curriculum, we must teach our children to be kind, to learn, to be curious, to question, and to become caring, tolerant people. I was told that my speech has been titled Regents' Priorities. However, I do believe, and I will give you 4 priorities in a minute, that the Regents' priorities should mirror the aspirations of the community. We serve all New Yorkers. So with that content, and given a time limit, I'm going to focus on 4 priorities: effective teachers and principals, assessment systems, which is about monitoring learning, learning standards, now called Aim High New York, and state aid. Those are the 4 priorities I can focus on in the time we have together this evening. It is New York State's budget season. I understand that you will be meeting with legislators. Several of them are holding local budget hearings. Ask them to increase funding to support the legislation for these priorities, and I'm going to go into them now individually. They have equal weight, and they're in the best interest of our children. They require that the state funding formulas support the efforts to translate aspirations into policy and practice. So let's start with the teachers. Hopefully, we all grew up with teachers that had a lasting impression on our lives. I did. In fact, I can give you 2. My kindergarten teacher, Mrs. Titterton, who gave me the starring role in the Thanksgiving play as Tom the Turkey. He was the star of the play, and I had the longest speaking lines, which were all of 3 sentences. But at 5 years of age, to be on the stage with a collage, with a paper mache mask of Tom the Turkey, and to offer those lines, she got me started. I was a poor kid from the housing project, and she made sure I had that center stage for a few minutes. And my other teacher was my English teacher, who was also my class advisor, Mrs. Gold, who taught me the value and importance of writing from your heart and of using writing as a means of conveying your beliefs, your values, and of inspiring and motivating and challenging people. I'm here today because of the high standards these 2 teachers and others set for me. Yet as a community, we snap at the run-down heels of the profession. The education reporter Dana Goldstein, in her book, The Teacher Wars, published in 2014, looks at American history and describes a recurring situation of what she calls moral panic. The tendency, you see, when there's an economic or social crisis, to lay blame on public school teachers. They must have created the crisis, the logic goes, by failing to educate the young. Now, if you listen carefully to the narrative in The Big Short, which is one of the 5 movies up for an Academy Award, listen carefully as the exchange takes place, and you will be stunned to hear that we as teachers are now the villains who contributed to the fiscal crisis that created the Great Recession that dominated the early years of this century. The attacks on public school teachers have been particularly virulent. We can acknowledge, and I would be the first to do this, having spent almost 13 years as a superintendent, that ineffective teachers, if they can be fairly identified, should be removed. But what can be done to recruit a new cadre of better teachers? I always view myself as a teacher, and as a teacher, I'm always on a journey of continuous improvement. But one begins with the work of understanding that children are at the core of all decisions. Children are taught by teachers, one of the most powerful and enduring professions on this planet. I honor the profession. We give them our children, expecting preparation for meaningful life journeys. Time and time again, studies have shown that given the external factors, teachers can remain the single most important factor in student achievement. I worry a great deal about the effort to shame teachers because the current evaluation system has this strange theory of action. Achievement improves if we fire teachers. When the only purpose of an evaluation system is to decide who gets hired and who gets fired, it makes the teachers more guarded and less likely to embrace new ideas. That approach doesn't strengthen good teaching, it strangles it. Every teacher has the right to ask of every evaluation, how will this help me get better? That needs to be the first purpose of every effort to evaluate a teacher. Ladies and gentlemen, there is no funding in the executive budget to redo the teacher evaluation system, not a penny. Evaluating teachers by looking at the results of their teaching as well as what they do is an important step in an evaluation system. Yet how to do this is not so simple. As we demonize and shame teachers, the impact has been felt in schools. We've seen endless testing and test prep, a narrowing of the curriculum, and no doubt a deterioration in meaningful education, the kind that is difficult to test, because you see in quality classrooms of accomplished teachers, all students are highly engaged in learning. They make significant contributions to the success of the class through participation in high-level discussions and active involvement in their learning and the learning of others. There is noise and chatter in a highly effective classroom. It is not a quiet place. The rating of teachers and principals on a system that is still a work in progress is potentially harmful to not only staff but students, and this is a point we tried to clarify for everyone. While you think there is a moratorium, there is nothing that has changed. It is still 50% of a student's test score. It is still a score on the matrix. It is still a box that has effective, ineffective, and developing. The only thing that has changed is that the data cannot be used to fire a teacher. It is to be recorded. It can be shared with parents. Nothing has changed. The only way this system will change is if we get the opportunity to rewrite the entire system. With all the published inaccuracies that accompany both the student test scores and the teacher ratings, it's hard to imagine progress emerging from this system. At this point, it's not likely that anyone will be a better teacher because of his or her rating. We have to set a high set of performance standards for those entrusted with human life. The profession both transmits our history and anticipates our future as a nation. Now, the use of the tests that our students take, and I'll get to the purpose of those tests in a minute, the use of those tests were never validated for assessing teacher effectiveness. So you can't take an item that was meant for one purpose and arbitrarily apply it to another, and then make a decision about a person's career and the rest of a person's life. The use of a growth score that does not meet the conditions for utilization as a growth score, the use of VAM, a value-added measure that has been slammed by a number of research organizations as unreliable, all are flaws and all are still in place. So we have to ask ourselves, what is this moratorium? How do the highest achieving nations assess teacher performance? We want a system that is fair, transparent, and supported by parents and teachers. We want a system that not only assesses, but also builds teacher competency. So let me take you back to this past June. I am on the Board of Regents for 2 months, having spent over 12 years dealing with communities and boards of education. So I bring that naturally to the Board of Regents. I had no idea. There was a clash between what I had experienced and what I was about to experience. 6 of my colleagues, including myself, presented the Regents with a position paper that challenged every tenet in APPR. It was apparently an unprecedented challenge and led to name-calling, including calling us the gang. At the heart of our relationship was our understanding and experience as school district leaders. We have worked at the intersection of policy, practice, and theory. So the attacks on me and my colleagues were initially startling. And then we remembered, we're superintendents. We can handle this. What makes matters worse is by continuing to turn a deaf ear to the research on child and brain development, we continue to have an achievement gap that will never be closed by an evaluation system tied to test scores. Let me repeat that. We will never address the achievement gap if what we do is to publish systems and teacher performance tied to test scores. I'm going to come back to the issue of poverty and achievement later on in my comments. So while we have somewhat of a moratorium, I'm going to repeat this, there is no funding in the executive budget to revise the evaluation system. And the governor did not have the right to impose a policy on a piece of budgetary proposals. And I say that knowing that this has been taped because I have said this publicly before, he overstepped his bounds, and the legislators feared that if they opposed him, that districts would lose their state aid come January of this year. Now, I'm going to ask you what I've asked others in other groups. We wanted to fight that. We wanted to take the chance. We wanted to say, let's take the chance. We didn't win. But I would just like, by a show of hands, should we have taken the chance that the governor was going to take that money back? Yep. Should we have taken that chance? Well, we'll never know now because we couldn't win, but I will tell you something. I was ready to take the chance. So that's the issue of teacher effectiveness. And let me go on to standardized testing versus assessments. And feel free to make notes of questions because I'll take questions on any of this when I'm done. So I'm up to testing and assessment, the second of the priorities. I didn't realize there was a camera going, too. No industrialized country tests as frequently as we do. Now, okay. No industrialized country tests as frequently as we do. We question the assumption that high performance on standardized assessments truly equate to what we all mean by achievement. Today's political, social, economic arenas require adults who begin as students to be agile thinkers, astute problem solvers, and to possess the ability to develop curious, critical, imaginative personalities that prepare us all to work collaboratively and respectfully with others. It requires that we reflect on more than test scores. Learning is complex, therefore assessments need to be complex. There is no evidence that more time spent on tests improve academic performance. At least as measured by NAEP, which is the National Report Card, a long-standing test sometimes referred to as a nation's report card. Just as a side, and I'll come back to this, we just released the list of, quote, struggling schools. They're the same struggling schools that we had 10 years ago. They share a profile, which we'll come back to. They haven't changed. And the test scores haven't really changed. And I asked the question innocently, where's the research to ask us, to direct us to look at this differently? And I don't get an answer. And I think I should add this is an ad lib. There is no money in the executive budget for a research department at the Department of Education and the SED Regents. How can you make policy absent research? So I was sharing with my colleagues at the table, I've discovered a new term. It's called parachute decision making. And they said, what's that? I said, what I've learned is it just drops from the sky. I picked it up immediately. That's what we do. No, that is not the way you make decisions about the lives of children. And often I keep saying to everyone, please keep in mind that at the center of the table, as these decisions are made, are the lives of 3 million children. What I had really hoped to do, and I haven't been able to pull this off yet, is to start every Regent meeting with a group of kids from the neighboring communities to provide some form of performance. I just haven't been able to get around to it, but it is my intent to start bringing students to the Regents meetings for the opening session, because I want everyone to remember we're there for kids. We're there for kids. They are what we represent as a legacy. We want to make sure that they're going to ensure that we continue to be a democratic country. That only happens through schools. So you have to ask yourself, and I know this has really been this has been a real bone of contention for parents, what did we do wrong? Well, for starters, the assessments were premature and untested, and we need to get it right. The implementation was flawed, was misinterpreted, and mismanaged. I read that part of it. I talked about today's adults and what we want to do. So let me just go on to this. By almost any definition, critical thinking requires grounding one's beliefs in evidence rather than an emotion or desire, and learning how students develop complex skills through assignments and assessments that require them to explain and defend ideas both in written and oral form in their work. Students are expected to demonstrate the ability now not to memorize and recall, but to cite evidence, to handle ambiguity, and to have multiple perspectives in problem solving. Developing their own point of view, revising work, all of those are what we call multiple measures of assessment. The tasks and activities in these assessments must be models worthy of attention and of the energy of teachers and students. To be as useful as possible, assessments should provide clues as to why students think the way they do, how they are learning as well as they are learning, the reasons for the misunderstandings when there's an issue of rigor. The system I would like to see, and the one we're going to have to help you grasp, is a system of multiple measures. Ongoing assessment, not pen and pencil tests. There is a place for that, by the way. There is a place for stopping and assessing reading and math skills, but it is not the way in which we measure whether a school is making progress or not. It's a temperature-taking item, so it tells us whether or not our kids can read, because that's really important. But that is not the only way in which we understand kids can demonstrate their reading. So the system that we are looking at, the 6 of us that we are proposing, as I said, has multiple measures, intertwined concepts, personalization, competency-based learning. Yes, that's going to be controversial, because that means that as you approach the computer, it will ask you some questions, it will measure your level of knowledge, and will move you on to the next step. We need to get this right because we need your support for this. But if we get it wrong, all you're going to say is, my kid's spending too much time at the computer, because we won't have explained to you what we're trying to do. And I think one of the biggest issues that we have right now is that there's an absence of a department in the state education department called parent and family engagement. And so there is a need for that. It's in our budget. It's not in the governor's budget. So we need your help. We do. I wish I could turn to Washington. I just spent a little bit of time. I spent almost 4 years as first a Deputy Assistant Secretary for Elementary and Secondary Ed, and then the Acting Assistant Secretary for Elementary and Secondary Ed. I learned a lot about how money is spent. And now that I've had that experience, I would love to go back, because I know now how we should spend that money. I remember getting a phone call one day saying, you left out $3 billion. I don't even know how many zeros are in $3 billion. But I will tell you that I did say put it into pre-K, because that's where I felt the money needed to go. So we need this parent and family engagement unit, because we need to reach out to the 600-plus school districts and spend a lot of time educating parents. School is not the place you attended or the place I attended, and don't expect it to look that way. In fact, if it does look that way, we're in trouble. Seriously. And it certainly isn't my classroom, where the book was Dick and Jane, I think. Dick and Jane. And I got into trouble because I wanted to know where Spot was going. So it's a true story. And I turned the page, and I got into trouble because you're not supposed to turn the page until the teacher tells you to turn the page. That would not happen with multiple measures, because you want the students to know, you want to know what the level of inquiry is, and you want a student to say, where the heck is he going, and for what purpose? And you want them to develop a story, a narrative around, here's what I'd like to see Spot do. That's the difference between what I was asked to do, which was simply read the words, and what we would ask our students to do today. Does that make sense to all of you? Yes. That's what a classroom needs to look like. And we need to help parents understand that's what the classroom needs to look like. So there is a new law out. I can't really give you a summary. That's a separate presentation. It's called Every Student Succeeds Act. But I will say just a few things about it under assessments. The state still is required to administer math and ELA assessments every year, and science assessments, I think, in grades 4 and 8. And these assessments are to be the same assessments for all students, except for those with the most severe cognitive disabilities. And that's limited to 1% of the students in the state. But the limit can be waived if necessary. Now, the new addition to this ESSA is that assessments may be partially delivered in the form of portfolios, projects, extended performance tasks. And there are $8 million in the budget to develop this. So that is a promising sign, and I'm going to just offer this. You need to make a note of this. We are accepting resumes and applications from people who'd like to sit on some of these committees. So if you've got folks in your school district or in your parent community, and please, they have to come with a level of expertise, who would like to be part of these conversations, they are to send their letters and their applications in. I would send it to two places: to the Regent that represents your district, and to the Commissioner of Education. I would send it both places. I would make sure the Regent had a copy of it so that person could lobby for your candidate, and then the Commissioner is accepting them. And I'm going to, when I come back to Common Core and what we're doing, that is critically important. But I'm going to add the piece that you have to bring some level of understanding. For example, I attempted to fill out the state survey, and I really don't know what a 5-year-old can do. So I felt it was unfair for me to rate something as appropriate or inappropriate. I haven't taught a 5-year-old in 30 years. And so that 5-year-old of 30 years ago is not today's 5-year-old. So there is a need for really talented teachers as well as parents to play. Now, a parent of a 5-year-old is a really good person to have on that, because you see it on a daily basis and you know what 5-year-olds are likely to do. Okay, so I'm going to go from assessments now to Common Core learning standards. And is somebody timing me to make sure I don't go over my time? Am I doing okay? Common Core learning standards. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this because of my belief system. The standards movement began in the 1990s and has remained at the core of our efforts to introduce rigor into instruction. The initial effort was a voluntary effort launched by 17 states and 5 cities. For us, it was New York State and the city of White Plains. And I was the assistant superintendent sitting on the executive committee, because at that time I was the assistant superintendent in White Plains. Our commissioner was Tom Sobel, and I will tell you, I've worked with several commissioners. There will never be another. I hope there will be. I should rephrase that. There's been no one like him sense, because he was there on behalf of kids. And he made moral decisions that were unpopular because he knew they were the right decisions to make. And he stood tall. So it provided teachers with a new level of professional development that converted those school communities into professional learning communities. Silos, closed classroom doors disappeared. Doors opened. Teachers began to, without fear of reprisal or shame, began the work of converting pedagogy from memorization and recall to investigation and innovation. The arts were an important element of this movement because they are natural performance-based assessments. So allow me to spend a few minutes on the arts. Consider the arts a suite of tools for human expression that defines us as a species. Or imagine the arts as the glue that binds nations in a realm of universality that is independent of native language. While I do not suggest that the arts represent a silver bullet, they are an essential component of an educational program focused on producing global citizens able to interpret the views of culturally diverse societies through an appreciation of artistic systems or genres. I do submit that exposure to the arts can have an effect on a student's sense of tolerance and empathy. So in addition to academics, and this is something that I want to make sure you carry back home, in addition to academics, every student should develop his or her individual talents to further increase feelings of competence, feeling that I've accomplished something. Which talents, whether it's playing a sport, playing a musical instrument, dancing, drawing, creative writing, computer programming, which talent is less important than the feelings of competence and joy that accompany the result? And that's what we need to offer to our schools. So I believe much of the difficulty with the Common Core standards came because the advocates didn't do enough to explain them early and clearly. Once states adopted the standards, parents needed to hear from principals and teachers and superintendents about the reason for the changes, how they would help our kids, how things would be bumpy for a number of years as teachers adjusted to the new standards. But I also understand why the step was missed. This the 21st version of the standards movement, 21st century version of the standards movement, ignored the learning that emerged from the new standards project, ignored the importance of ongoing research, ongoing teacher input, the joy of presentation, the time investments needed, and most of all, there should have been no focus on failure or punishment. We did not examine the lessons of our own work from the 1990s. It would have sought to prepare students to be productive contributors to our economy, responsible citizens, and fulfilled and caring human beings. I continue to support the movement to more rigorous educational standards for all students. In fact, I'm willing to bet there is no one in this room who would really oppose this concept. When thoughtfully framed, rigor fits into the ways we should teach, applying knowledge, demonstrating innovation, introducing the essential skills of distilling facts to reach a conclusion or an outcome. I worry that schools will remain isolated from the larger society and be expected to solve the problems for which they are not equipped. Now we need to spend a few minutes on the achievement gap. We need to deeply explain why the achievement gap continues to exist. We do in New York State isolate children by race and economics, and also in this country, and the resources are too often uneven. So before I summarize your advocacy tasks, I want to take a few minutes to discuss this poverty issue. The data appear irrefutable. The lowest performing schools share in common high percentages of children whose families live in poverty. But I want to underscore the next sentence. Not all poor children are poor achievers. Not all poor children are poor achievers. American public schools were once the vehicle that provided access to the concept of economic mobility. Public schools were viewed as the great equalizer, and students were able to, regardless of birth conditions, receive an education that led to opportunities to climb the American economic ladder of personally defined success. There is no funding in the executive budget to redo the standards. There is no funding to redo the standards. So let's talk a little bit about children in poverty. It's a real personal issue for me. I mentioned briefly that I grew up in the first housing project in New York City. My dad was a worker in the Brooklyn Navy Yard during the Second World War, and they housed all of the workers in the Fort Greene housing project so that they could walk to the Navy Yard. I didn't realize I was poor for years, by the way, because the neighborhood is so confined, you don't know what the rest of the world looks like. You only know your own world. I'm going to take a minute and tell you a story about that. For reasons that I guess we'll never fully be able to explain, they would give IQ tests in New York City schools every year, and New York City sorted students by IQ score. So if you were in 6'1", that meant you were at one level. If you were in 6'10", you were in deep trouble. I managed to make the one class every year, except for 1 year where the teacher said to me, "You failed the IQ test." Can you imagine that? And I was put in 6'2", I think it was, either 5'2" or 6'2". You don't fail an IQ test. So, but now let me take you forward. So that's, by the way, when you say that to a student, think about that today. When you tell a student you scored at level 1 or 2, do you know what you're saying to that student? You're a failure. You're a failure. And that's the message we don't want to send to kids. So that's a huge mistake that we make. I still carry that. I can tell this story that many years later because it just like, I sat there stunned. I'd failed an IQ test. But I want to talk a little bit about what it meant to suddenly discover there was more than the Fort Greene projects, because Mrs. Gold was determined to take us poor kids to some place called Broadway to see a play. Never heard of it. And I lived just below the Brooklyn Bridge, maybe a couple of blocks away. We get on this yellow school bus and off we go to Broadway to see a play. And the reason why we were going to see this play is we were studying the play as a book. And she wanted us to understand how you translate, think about this woman now, translate literature into life and into theater so you can act it out and understand it and feel it. You'll guess this play in a minute. And I'm sitting there and I'm watching the story of this young girl unfold who's hiding in an attic. And first it's her life as a 13-year-old, and then I realize she's hiding from the Gestapo. And the play ends as you hear them stomping up the steps. They're going to pick up Anne, and off she goes. And I looked outside and I realized there's more than the Fort Greene projects. But the important part of this story is that taking a poor kid to a Broadway production opened my eyes to another part of the world. How dare we deny children that opportunity? I mean, I'm standing here today because of the experiences she had, and the problem I'm having in America right now, not every kid's getting that opportunity. And we do have to figure out what we did wrong. So we talk a little bit about poverty and a loss of hope and hopelessness. Exposure to trauma has a profound impact on cognitive development and academic outcomes. And schools and teachers are woefully unprepared to contend with those realities. Dealing with traumatic situations should not be seen as pathological. Instead, educators need to recognize the resilience these students are showing, and the instruments and surveys that have been used to measure social emotional skills, such as persistence and grit, have not taken this into effect. So let me just give you some samples. And this is from a psychologist, Howard. Always provides two ways of considering the distractions that may affect a student's success in school. A prompt is a sentence and you respond to it. Prompts typically used to gauge a student's persistence or grit include, here's an example of a prompt. New ideas and projects sometimes distract me from previous ones. And you rate that from 1 to 5. I often set a goal, but later choose to pursue a different one. And you rate that. Here's another prompt. Setbacks don't discourage me. This is asked of 8 and 9-year-olds. Now let me give you some prompts that they never find on a test. Daily struggles that a student may face. I always have bus fare to get to school. Rate that 1 to 4. Whenever I get sick, I'm able to go to a doctor. Rate that 1 to 4. I have at least one teacher who cares about me. Rate that one. And here's one that a kid gave to me personally that I've added to this. I know how to keep my clothes from being stolen in the laundromat. Rate that. That's persistence and grit that we don't measure. And think about that. I know how to keep my clothes. It startled me for a minute. And then I realized how far removed I am now from laundromats, that I would not have thought of that. So we need academic climates that really are mindful of the prompts in the lives of children, particularly those who live in poverty. Schools can do a better job of talking about the extent to which student trauma exists, teaching children coping mechanisms, and providing mental health services. The conversations about growth mindsets has to happen in a social and cultural context because cultural, institutional, and historical factors and forces have an effect on children. No one chooses to be poor. Believe me, no one wants to be poor. No one wants to depend on the system for survival. Being poor eats at your self-esteem. And in America, 6 out of 10 children born in poverty will enter adulthood still poor. It does affect each and every one of us in this room. This is about hopelessness. Children enter school each day looking for the teachers who've not given up on them and who can offer some tangible reasons for hope. Christoph, who is a columnist on the New York Times, offers an article on hope, and he asks, if poverty and the loss of hope lead to a whirlpool of despair, and if it does, can they be retrieved? The answer is yes, it can be. Full-day kindergarten, full-day pre-K, caring teachers, wraparound services, yes, we have to have the moral will to make it happen. Schools in the early to mid-20th century were havens of hope. In America, as education was seen as the great equalizer, now I have to ask the question, is this about to become an abandoned tradition? If we're going to make a difference in classrooms, we also need to make a difference in the lives of these children, many of whom struggle against the debilitating effects of poverty, hopelessness, and trauma. Why have we become the voices of concern? The Gang of Six, as they call us. Schools have never been about passing a standardized test. That's defining education much too narrowly. And I do not mean to diminish the centrality of academic competency, but it is the application of knowledge to life setting that is the real measure of competence. Yes, we want students to know and be able to understand history and to succeed in math and English and science, but that's not the entire mission. Throughout our history, the goal of school has been to prepare our students to be effective citizens and caring human beings. Acknowledging the need to change and improve with contemporary society does not necessitate a wholesale abandonment of our core values, our essential mission, and the overarching covenant that we must uphold to preserve the public school. We can preserve the past and also look to the future each and every day in our public schools. While we continue to ask ourselves what academic skills and knowledge we want our students to acquire, we also have to ask ourselves the following questions. What kind of people do we want our children to become? What kind of lives do we want them to lead? And what kind of society do we want them to create? These are not idle questions. The answers have much to say about the future of our country. And I would add, we do not think often enough about the future of our country. Schools are not just about individual achievement. They are about the cultivation of the common good. Schools must both transmit traditions and adapt to ever-changing social and economic conditions. Traditions can be honored, but we cannot be bound by them. We must be prepared to create new traditions that recognize schools as dynamic institutions. Schools, you see, remain the major public institution constructed for the public good. In fact, schools are probably the only shared experience that unites most Americans. So I hope we will not raise a generation of children who may have high intellectual quotients, but low caring and compassion quotients, with highly developed technical skills, but poorly developed consciences, with a gigantic commitment to the big I, but little sense of responsibility to the bigger we, with access to the internet's massive library of disconnected information, but absent a moral context to determine its worth, with more and more knowledge and less imagination, with more and more worldliness and less wonder, and less awe for everyday miracles of life. The current debate about school reform policies suggests we must pause to revisit the purpose of public education. Schools can transmit our history to each generation, and while we honor these traditions, we cannot be bound by them. Now, I've laid out a huge agenda for you. There are no neat and tidy solutions to the crisis facing America right now. I do know that we are tagging some bodies as worthy, BODIES bodies, and others as damaged. And we do know those damaged bodies reside in our homeless shelters and with greater frequency in our prisons. The reality is in the United States is that persistent educational achievement gaps are generating a massive waste of both human talent and economic potential, and the darkness has reached the once secure boundaries of the middle class. So can we turn this ship around? Can we exert the energy and moral will to make it happen? Do we want to restore the principles of democracy for all without distinctions of birth conditions or zip codes? I'd like to conclude by summarizing what I feel are the essential themes, but I think I'm going to modify this a little bit. I'm going to finish the speech and then go to the PowerPoint as opposed to injecting it in here. So let me just offer some concluding thoughts. Ron Edmonds, a policy analyst and activist who led the school reform movement in the 1980s, once said, "We all know what needs to be done to provide the escape hatch from poverty. The question is not what is to be done. The question is, do we have the will to do it?" School is a powerful social experiment. When we can defend and define that will, then we take the victory lap. Thank you. Thank you. Amen at the computer? Okay. So, it's a little scary here. Okay, so I understand this is going to be put on your website so that you can download it. But you will see that, I think I'll look at my printed notes. You will see that there are 3 categories here: the aid that we're looking for, the Regents' proposed increases, and the government's proposed governor's. We are asking for $1.7 billion. The governor is proposing a little over $500 million. That is a huge gap, huge. We're asking for the money for pre-K, and he is saying, maybe I'll give it to you, but it cannot be the domain of the Board of Regents. It needs its own separate board. We don't really know what that means, because in an educational system, it's pre-K through college. So why would you separate the early childhood education from the rest of the programs? Okay, we're asking for aid for struggling schools, particularly professional development, and you'll notice he zeroed that out. And I will tell you that you can't, in 2 years, there is something wrong with the receivership law, because if school districts were not able to fix this in 10 years, how do you fix it in 1 or 2? You know, and those are the kinds of questions we ask as school superintendents. Really, in 1 or 2 years, we're going to suddenly do all the things that we haven't done in 10 years. Ladies and gentlemen, if we knew what to do, we wouldn't have struggling schools. So we need a long-term first of all, we need the moral will to make the difference. That's number one. We really care. And we have to overinvest in our struggling schools to level the playing field. So he zeroed it out. There is a transition to digital learning, and I briefly described that to you. He has zeroed that out. There is the family and community engagement. We're going to fight real hard for this. Please do that. Help us with this, because he doesn't see the value of having a place for parent voice. I cannot even begin to explain how that decision was made. And then there are the P-TECH programs, which are excellent programs. And I didn't get to discuss multiple pathways for graduation. So we are moving rapidly away from only the way to graduate from high school is to pass 5 Regents exams. That made little sense. So we're looking at multiple pathways. It will take some time, but it will also give students an opportunity to specialize in the arts, in technology, in careers. Those are the ones that are being looked at right now. Ultimately, there'll be 18 different ways, all rigorous, to achieve a high school diploma. And the concern that I have, the unintended outcome, is our special ed students can't graduate. And I don't think anyone asked that question. And now we're getting bombarded with the phone call. My kid never missed a day of school as a special ed student. He's been in school for 13 years. They're going to give him a CDOS. That's what it's called, a CDOS? I didn't know what that was. So I said, what is that? And it is not honored by the armed services. It is not honored by community colleges. That's all I had to hear. And it's not honored by employers. That is not graduating from high school. So we need multiple ways to do this. So this is another way of looking at what we see to be our themes and priorities. I think I found almost all of them in what I was given in terms of your priorities when you start your lobbying. And you'll see down at the bottom college and career pathways, and that's building the relationships between colleges and community colleges primarily, community colleges and K-12 systems. And the move toward digital learning, I hope we do a good job of explaining this to you because it's a reality. And I know that if we do it poorly, there'll be another parent resistance to putting kids in front of computers. We need to make sure we get it right, and you need to ask your questions right from the start. Ask the questions and insist on answers. And we understand that we can't change the tax cap because that has to come from the legislative body. And this I really don't want to say on camera, but I don't know how you pass this budget without going to an override because you're going to end up with having to cut in some way in order to get through the upcoming school year. So this looks like what we want versus what the governor wants. It's pretty graphic. I don't have to explain it. You can just see that's wonders of graphics. We are the education body, the policy-making body. Remember, our decisions are at the core. Children are at the core of our decisions. I don't know if they're at the core of the executive budget. It's another way to look at it, giving high-need districts a good percentage of the money. Now, New York State is now, of the 50 states, the most segregated state in the country. That's a reality. We look like 1954. And the willingness to do something about that is really not there yet. So while we're trying to figure out what we do about that, because that has a lot to do with the willingness to look at school zoning very differently, and what that's going to be a battle. What do we do to support the kids who are in our high-need schools? We can't have them sitting back waiting for the cases to be resolved. We've got to do something for them while this works its way through the courts. And I really think, Michael, we're going to have to fight segregation. Among other things, we have to take that on. How we do that, I don't know. And I'm glad I'm retired because they can't take my pension away from me. Because it's going to be an ugly battle. It's going to be an ugly battle to try to do something about that. The evidence is so strong that kids in culturally diverse settings, all of them perform at higher levels than when they're in racially isolated settings. And when the racially isolated settings are kids of color, that's where you see the problems. And there were so many reasons. That's another presentation. There were so many reasons for that. Now, I want to point out the timeline for Common Core and the rebooting of it. And I think it's going to be called New York AIM High Standards. And I'm certainly not going to read this, but you can see that it starts this month with work groups. I'm going to encourage you again to invite people to be part of this work group by making sure they get their letters with resumes into the commissioner and to the regent in their area. And this is the timeline for getting this done, which means that the assessments would be done sometime in 2017, 2018, which is very soon. And then you see the teacher and principal evaluation. Here's the problem, the reason why I brought these slides. There's no money to do this. So you understand the importance of getting this work done, but there are no dollars in the budget to get this done. So we need your help. If you think that we need to redo and reboot the standards, and if you think we need to redo the teacher evaluation system, then you need to help us by getting us the dollars, or at least advocating for the dollars needed to do it. The department itself is very understaffed. It has lost 400 positions in the last 6 or 7 years. So the people that are left are doing double the amount of work, and it's brand-new work, but people who've been around with existing work and now brand-new work. And I don't know whether that's purposeful or not, and I know that there are other states that are looking at their departments of education very differently. But if we're going to keep a Department of Education, then we need to figure out how to fund it so it has meaningful purpose, because that's where the resources and the help should be coming through, not just a bureaucratic decision about who's a failing school and who's not. And that's all they're capable of doing at this point because of the few people that are there. So with that, I will stop and now take your questions. To the what? The written, what I just, this, yes, it's going to be, it's on his computer already. Okay. Other questions? Yes, this is not a shy group, I know. Yes. Okay. All right. The history of charter schools goes back to 1997 and the Bill Clinton administration. Although there were some in place before then, Al Shanker had the concept of charter schools in the early 1980s. And I will tell you that we thought at the time that this was an opportunity to free public schools of massive levels of bureaucracy by creating these lighthouses in every school district and giving them the freedom to operate without the red tape, and then taking and translating that experience to the regular schools. That was the goal of a charter school. So it was like a lighthouse. Unintended consequences. And we didn't think them through. How do you fund a charter school without damaging the public school? How do you ensure that the operators of charter schools understand education and are not in it to earn or gain money? And how do you ensure that both groups of kids are well educated? Because charter schools will never have more than 5% of the student population. So what about the other 95%? And when you see buildings where in the same building where they're cohabitating, and when the charter school has all of this great new equipment and the public school doesn't, that's glaring. So candidly, the charter school law is in place. We're not going to override it. We're not going to redo it. And that's never going to happen, I know. What we need to do is increase the oversight, the integrity, and the evaluation of charter schools. Because right now, they're not held to the same evaluation measures that public schools are held to. That's where we have to make our work. It's the best I can offer you at this point. Okay. Yes. That is the basis of behind competency-based testing, and that is that you will move students along based on the knowledge they've acquired and they can demonstrate. So it's going to we really have to do a good job of explaining this. It's fraught with possibilities that we didn't anticipate. We have to be careful about it. I would say at some point, first of all, they do this in high-performing private schools already. And in many of the schools, they don't even have grade levels. They have groups of kids who move along based on their interests and their achievement. And if we really had our druthers, I would really eliminate many grades. I would have 3 levels of grades in elementary school: early childhood, middle, and late. And that would be it. And you'd move in each of those levels. I tried that with Rick Mills, and he shut me down. So I thought I would at least be, I was willing to try it in the school district I was in at the time. Probably the more realistic thing is the competency-based testing will take us there. And that's going to happen sooner, not rather than later. So watch that as it moves along, and watch for the policies that your district puts in place around competency-based testing. You want to ask the question, how will the data be used to determine whether or not my child moves forward? That's the question you want to ask as it unfolds. Okay? Oh, I can take. I'm fine. Oh, okay. Oh, the students. Oh, the students. They are wonderful. We want to see the students. We do. Yeah. Okay. Yes. I don't have an answer for you. Yes, it's true. I don't have an answer for you at this point because we don't have any guidelines to direct charter schools. They are, as we thought, independent agencies that can set their own rules, and that's a problem. Okay? Well, okay, you're going to really enjoy these students. They are wonderful. So let's enjoy that together. Thank you again very much.
Thank you very much.
Is that okay?
Oh, it was beautiful. I wish we had time for you to take more questions.
Thank you. Okay, got it. Got
And I
it.
think a few people want to take a picture.
Okay. Got it. Okay.
Thank you again.
You're more than welcome.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Right. Right.
We're going to stay and see
I'm
the
going to
students.
stay. I love
Are you
it. I
going to
know.
join us?
Yes. I know these kids. I want to see them. Yeah. Yeah. I actually have them.